Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chad Severs and I'll be your webinar moderator for today. I wanted to just kind of briefly explain what my program is all about, and then I'll introduce our speaker and do some housekeeping announcements. So as I mentioned, my name is Chad Severs. I'm the project manager for Arkansas Building Effective Services for Trauma, or ARBEST. And we are a state-funded program at the UAMS Psychiatric Research Institute. And our aim is to improve mental health services for children who have experienced trauma from events such as abuse, natural disasters, or family separation. We work really closely with our child advocacy centers here in the state and other providers to build a trauma-informed mental health system. And we're probably best known for providing training to mental health professionals and treatments that are effective in helping children recover from trauma. So again, just kind of wanted to briefly introduce myself and my program. And let me do a few housekeeping announcements, and then I'll introduce your speaker and turn it over to Dr. Vanderzee. We really encourage you to ask questions during this presentation, and so you can use the question feature, which is on the right side of your screen. If you're interested in earning a CEU, just be sure to stick around to the very end. We'll have a code that's given, and I'll have some more instructions at that point. We are recording this webinar, and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel at a later date, so you can check us out there. We also have previously recorded webinars there as well. If you happen to be watching this at a later date on our YouTube channel, please know we only award CEUs for attending live presentations. And if this topic or other training opportunities are of interest to you, you can like us on Facebook. We frequently post about these sorts of things there. So that's a good way to kind of stay connected with us. Okay, so Dr. Karin Vanderzee is our presenter today, and I have the privilege of knowing Karin for, we'll just say some time now, and I know not only is she an expert on this topic, but she's also very passionate and working with these families and kids. She is a trainer in a couple of our evidence-based treatments like PCIT and CPP. She's also trained in TFCBT, so she's got the clinical background and know-how, and like I said, she's very passionate and extremely knowledgeable about this population. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and you can give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Vanderzee.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chad, for such a kind welcome. And hello to everybody on this chilly Arkansas day. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention a big thank you to Stacia McDonald, who was one of the folks that was really instrumental in getting this webinar off the ground and helping to help us all to consider some of the issues that arise when working with court-involved children and families, particularly around placement issues. So the decisions that, hold on here, Chad. It's not advancing for me. There we go. So the decisions that judges face kind of regarding placement for child welfare cases, particularly those decisions that are made following termination of parental rights, are really complex and difficult. Many people from many disciplines can contribute to child welfare proceedings. And so mental health professionals and legal professionals routinely interact with one another in the context of these court cases, where legal professionals attempt to provide the courts with information relevant for determining permanent placement based off of the best interests of the child. So within these proceedings, mental health clinicians may be called to testify and be asked to provide information related to the child's attachment to caregivers and or relationships with siblings. So during today's webinar, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the law, which details the order in which various caregivers should be considered for permanent placement. Then I'll talk about the roles of mental health professionals within court proceedings and highlight the difference between fact and expert witnesses. Then I'll talk about the terms bonding and attachment. And then finally, I'll talk about various research findings related to disrupted attachments and or bonds between children and their caregivers or siblings. Okay, so within child welfare proceedings, a permanency hearing is scheduled to occur no later than 12 months after the date that a child was first considered to have entered into foster care, or 30 days after the court really determines that reasonable efforts to return the child to the parent are not required, whichever of those things happens first. So after the initial permanency hearing, subsequent permanency hearings are to be scheduled every 12 months while the child is in foster care. So judges take into consideration all of the information that's presented to them in order to make placement determinations, okay? And so at this permanency planning hearing, the court considers for placement the following caregivers in preferred order. So first, a fit parent. Then the parent from which the child was actually removed. Then they consider, if those parents are not able, is there a fit and willing relative that could step in to provide care for the child? Next, a potential adoptive parent or a custodian, okay? So within the context of these hearings, judges may hear from expert or fact witnesses to inform their decision-making. And some of you on today's call may have already provided expert or fact witness testimony. So some of you might be aware of the differences between those, but for those of you who are not, we're going to talk through them. Okay, so let's start with expert witnesses. An expert witness is a witness in court proceedings who has the training, knowledge, or experience that's necessary in order to provide a really specialized opinion related to some evidence that's presented in court proceedings on a particular subject. So this is a person who, when testifying, is going to be qualified by the judge as an expert witness. And that may be done so according to the person's credentials and background and experience. An expert witness provides testimony based on materials that are provided to him or her by someone who is actually a party to the case. Importantly, he or she could have, but does not have to have interacted with a child or family directly in order to provide an expert witness opinion. So let's talk about a fact witness. So a fact witness is someone whose testimony is really related to firsthand knowledge, facts, or observations of a client or a family. So this is not someone whose qualifications, background, experience is looked at intently by a judge in order to determine if they qualify as an expert witness. A fact witness testifies really about their specific observations or interactions with a client. Could be related to attendance or treatment progress, for example. Testimony for fact witnesses is really limited to what he or she knows as opposed to what he or she may speculate. And fact witnesses typically have a relationship with a client and often caregivers. And as a result of this relationship, they may be biased in their opinions because they've spent all of this time kind of developing that relationship. Fact witnesses also do not typically have access to all of the information that would be necessary in order to provide an expert opinion about things such as placement or visitation. So if you have to testify in court proceedings, it's very, very important that you understand the difference between a fact and an expert witness in order to maintain your role. So therapists who are not employed by the court are typically testifying in that fact witness role, kind of given their relationship with a client and family. So within the testimony of expert and fact witnesses, attorneys may often ask questions related to bonding and attachment. So these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, both within legal and mental health circles, but within the literature, they're often considered to be separate, although related ideas having to do with the caregiver and child relationship. When thinking about this literature, it's really important to note that studies of bonding in particular have primarily been conducted with biological parents, but the idea of bonding extends to all caregivers. So therefore, where it says parent on this slide, you could also substitute the word caregiver, and that would be just fine. So bonding, what I mean by that is bonding refers to the affective tie from a parent to a child, which originates from caregiving processes and is intended to protect the child. According to one theoretical model, the core of bonding is really an emotional state, sort of like love, that is related to a set of needs, including knowing or being with, avoiding separation and loss from, protecting and gratifying the needs of the child. So at this point within the literature, bonding patterns and correlates have been relatively studied, but there are some interesting findings that have come up within the literature. First, there are patterns to bonding that really appear to be stable over time. So by that I mean, if a parent is highly bonded with her baby during pregnancy, it's very likely that she'll be highly bonded with her child later in toddlerhood. So it stays stable kind of over time. And second, there are some interesting correlates related to various bonding patterns. So parents with very high bonding tend to show the best adjustment, whereas those with low levels of bonding report greater parenting stress, anxiety, and that their child may have a difficult temperament. So again, bonding is really kind of the parent's impression of the relationship. So more from the parent to the child. So bonding refers to that affective tie of a parent to a child. Then attachment captures part of the child's experience. Importantly, though, the term attachment does not cover the entirety of the parent-child relationship from the child's perspective. Instead, it really refers to the behaviors that a child exhibits when he or she is scared or tired or sick in order to stay close to a caregiver, in order to receive comfort, in order to feel safe. So children are biologically hardwired to attach to a caregiver for survival. Attachment is not determined by a single interaction. Instead, it is built in what I'll kind of refer to as micro moments over thousands and thousands of interactions. And the quality of a child's attachment to a caregiver depends in large part to the attachment figure's attunement or responsiveness and sensitivity to the infant's cues and needs. So from there, we could suppose correctly that a child could and would very well have different attachment relationships with different caregivers. So in that sense, attachment is relationship specific. Arguably, the most important need of an infant or young child is to establish a healthy attachment relationship with a primary caregiver. That is true of children in foster care, those who are adopted, and those who still reside with their biological families. Developing a secure attachment is absolutely critical for future development. We can see the seeds of attachment being built from very, very early in development. So although from 2 to 7 months old, children do not yet have a preferred caregiver, they're learning already to discriminate between caregivers. So by 7 to 9 months, we really see selective attachments starting to come online. You might have noticed this, like when an infant protests when a separation occurs from a caregiver, they might cry. Or when an infant becomes really wary of strangers, perhaps when they've met you for the first time. Between 9 and 18 months, infants are developing a hierarchy of preferred attachment figures, and they will work down their hierarchy as needed. So if a baby's preferred caregiver is dad, if dad is there, the child will seek out dad for comfort, if that child is mobile at that point. If dad's not there and the child's next preferred caregiver is mom, the child may seek mom out next, and so on. And so they might work down their list of preferred caregivers. So how does attachment really fit in with development? John Bowlby, who's the father of attachment theory, theorized that attachment behaviors occur alongside exploratory behaviors in young children to help them balance kind of the accessibility of the caregiver and exploration and distance. In essence, in order for a child to go out and explore the world, he or she needs to know that someone will be there to help support and comfort him or her as is needed. When a primary attachment figure consistently acts as a secure base and safe haven for a child, the child develops a sense of security. So how this works is that in a situation, if a child makes an assessment that the environment is non-threatening, he or she may kind of go out from a caregiver and explore. So you might see this in young children, 2 or 3-year-olds, where maybe they're in a new environment, but mom or dad or a foster parent or grandparent may be present, and the child makes the assessment that things are okay. He or she may walk away for just a moment, and then may kind of return back to show the caregiver maybe what they have found. Children can demonstrate this secure-based behavior, not necessarily by just physically returning, but by looking over their shoulder or checking in visually or physically with a caregiver. If, however, the child makes an assessment that there's something threatening in the environment, they will want to be closer to their parent, so that exploration is reduced. Now, if a child makes an assessment that there is something highly threatening in the environment, they'll actually want to seek contact with the caregiver. They may not want to physically be put down. They want to be picked up and held close, away from what it is that has been scary for them. So it's within the context of these first relationships that children begin to learn expectations for how others will relate to him or her in the world. They also develop their sense of security, their worthiness of being, and many, many other things. So a child's attachment relationships then begin to act as a blueprint for the expectations that he or she has for others or for him or herself in future relationships. As I mentioned earlier, very young children require substantial and sustained physical contact with caregivers in order to form attachments. It's actually not until after early childhood that children are able to sustain attachments over time and space to caregivers with whom they don't have regular or substantial contact, okay? So young children have to have lots and lots of contact and sustained contact with caregivers in order to form attachments, okay? So part of the reason that older children are able to sustain attachments over time and space to caregivers with whom they don't have regular and substantial contact is because attachment changes as children grow in development. It reorganizes as children grow. So it is more of a mutual process. So in older children, we see that among securely attached dyads, both members really experience pleasure at being close to one another and at being affectionate with one another. And likewise, they both experience unhappiness, anxiety, or pain when they feel rejected. So after trauma, including separations from caregivers, attachment may be disrupted. So let's talk about what some of those outcomes are. You know, many of our children in foster care have experienced an attachment disruption, if not more than one. There are many, many negative outcomes associated with these disruptions in children's attachment relationships. So they can have, not surprisingly, attachment problems with their next caregivers. They can have changes in the ways in which their brains are organized. They can develop attachment patterns that are less helpful and are associated with problematic outcomes, things like poor emotion regulation, poor social skills, behavioral and emotional problems. As I mentioned earlier, if attachment really sets the stage for how children are going to be in relationships in the future, if they have disruptions, they can have difficulty establishing trusting relationships with others, which can lead to interpersonal problems with teachers or peers or with adults in general. Data also suggests that there may be changes in stress response systems, which can then lead to problematic outcomes for kids who've had these disruptions. And not surprisingly, after attachment disruptions, children may feel a sense of profound loss and grief at the loss of that relationship. We know that outcomes associated with attachment disruptions are not limited to just the childhood years, but in fact can go on to affect later development. So one of the findings is that attachment disruptions can influence the development of personality, such that those that have disruptions are at an increased risk for developing borderline and avoidant personality disorders when they grow up. Sadly, what we have learned from the research is that more disruptions are associated with more problem outcomes. So it's really in everyone's best interest to try to minimize the amount of attachment disruptions that occur for our children in care. So these data really should give us all pause and encourage us to do whatever we can to support healthy and secure attachment relationships of children, especially very young children, given all of the consequences that we're learning about related to development. Within the homes of many children who have been abused or neglected are other kids. So in these homes, and frankly in many homes, older siblings may engage in caretaking roles with younger children. Some of this is cultural, some of this may be due to other factors such as trauma as well. It's possible that a young child has developed an attachment relationship with an older sibling who provides care and nurturance to him or her. In fact, you know, we can see in the literature secure-based behavior between younger and older siblings. So just like with parents, siblings may promote either secure or insecure caregiving environments. My colleague, Dr. Phil Stepka, says, parenting comes naturally in the way that you were parented. And I think that's really true here. So if older siblings have experienced a secure, healthy attachment relationship with their caregivers, they will be more likely to pass this on to younger siblings if they're the primary caretaker for a younger sibling. So let's talk a little bit more about siblings in foster care. So before we jump in, I just have to say statistics regarding siblings are pretty difficult to come by. And by and large, the research on siblings in foster care is very difficult to conduct and has a number of limitations. So there are varying definitions of what constitutes a sibling. Is it someone who shares the same mother and father, just one of them? Do step siblings count? It is a very difficult construct within the literature to kind of pin down because studies are conducted in very different ways depending on how they define a sibling. Also, within the literature, there's no random selection of children who are going to be placed with or without siblings. And so, you know, when we think about some of the research that we are conducting, we want to have random selection to have the most confidence in our results, but we absolutely cannot do that in these situations because these are children's lives we're talking about. So all that just to say that, you know, we have to be mindful of that limitation as well. So some of these statistics really just have to be understood kind of in that context. So research suggests that more than 2/3 of kids who enter foster care also have a sibling in care. And among those who were adopted from child welfare, 82% had birth siblings. And about 40% of those kids were adopted into the same family. And so when we're thinking about the littlest children, in one study, again, this is one study, so again, speaking to how difficult this research is to conduct, in one county, they found that 37% of children under the age of 3 were placed in care without their siblings. Okay, so about 1/3 of them. There are many, many reasons that sibling relationships are important. For kids in foster care, this sibling relationship may actually be the last remaining tie to what they have known. And so this sense of normalcy that the child in care has can be preserved by maintaining that contact with a sibling. Siblings who are placed together can provide each other an opportunity to really share in that grief process and to give one another support kind of along the way. And for those children whose parents' rights are terminated, it may be the case that the sibling bond may be the strongest bond that either of those children will experience in the remainder of their lives. So the research on siblings placed together or apart and the outcomes associated with that is focused on the experiences of foster children primarily. What it shows is that they have greater stability in the sibling relationship. Basically, they're able to see and interact with one another consistently, which means that they're able to maintain their relationship. And that's compared to siblings who may not have had that same consistency. Siblings who are placed together show fewer emotional and behavioral problems. They show better emotional stability, a greater sense of belonging, and better school performance as well than those who are placed apart. They also tend to have fewer placement disruptions. They have better peer relationships, and generally, although we don't understand exactly how this works, they may feel closer to their foster families in the presence of a sibling. Research also tells us that sibling groups that are completely intact, meaning that all siblings are placed together, are more likely than those who have been separated to be reunified, be adopted, or to achieve permanent guardianship. So there's data that suggests that keeping kids together, keeping all kids in the same family together, may have a higher likelihood of being achieving a very positive outcome of being reunified, adopted, or achieving permanent guardianship. It seems to be that the consistency of placement with siblings, as opposed to the number of siblings that are actually placed together, that's what's related to better outcomes and adaptation. So keeping kids together is what's related to those better outcomes and adaptations. So that's most of the good news, right? However, not all of the outcomes for sibling groups that stay together in care are positive. So for siblings with shared extreme trauma histories, they can serve as trauma reminders. And in that context, that can lead to adjustment problems, conduct problems, or generally other problem behaviors. The research on siblings also suggests that siblings who are separated may, I should back up. So we should now shift to talking about outcomes of siblings who aren't placed together, okay? So this is where the research suggests that those who are separated can experience additional trauma due to that separation. So not only are these kids separated from biological caregivers, they may then be separated from their biological siblings, which could be another potentially traumatic event. They may also experience grief and loss of their natural support systems. They may feel confused and feel as though they don't really belong anywhere. And as I mentioned earlier, for those siblings who may be acting in that caretaker role, those siblings, those older siblings, may actually experience grief and loss at not being able to engage in that caregiving role with their siblings. So the research also shows that siblings being placed together or apart is relatively stable. So those that are placed together typically stay together in care, whereas those who are placed apart typically remain separated a year later. So that means what happens early in the process of selecting placements is particularly important for predicting whether siblings are going to be together or apart later on. Nope. There we go. So unfortunately, not all sibling relationships are healthy ones. Some of the authors kind of within the literature suggest that we have to consider the histories of all of the siblings, not only together, but individually as well, in order to determine the best placement for each of the children in the family. So we've got to look at all of their individual needs as well as the needs of the whole sibling group. So although the prevailing thought within the literature, which is also reflected in the courts, is that siblings should be placed together whenever possible, there are some circumstances in which separation of siblings should actually be considered. And the literature identifies several of these situations. So for example, if there are problematic sibling relationships or abusive relationships, it's wise to consider separate placements because these problematic or abusive behaviors may not just stop once children leave one home and move to the next, but they may actually continue, in which case additional trauma may be perpetrated from one child to another in another home. Another time when sibling separation could be considered is when a sibling or siblings have really severe mental or behavioral problems, which can severely negatively impact the other siblings that are in care or even compromise their safety. Another circumstance to consider separation outlined by the literature is when a particular child's special needs couldn't be met in the home of a sibling. So, you know, it's probably easy to think about a child, for example, who is medically fragile and siblings' caregivers are unable to provide the necessary care for the child. That's an instance where it may be appropriate, again, to consider sibling separation. For infants and young children, Myron and colleagues call for really careful consideration of the costs and benefits of placement with siblings when an infant has an established attachment relationship. So this is kind of tying together the sibling piece with the attachment piece. They identify costs as, first, having a child disrupted from his or her primary attachment figures, which could lead to the consequences of an attachment disruption, you know, that I talked about before, including experience of loss and grief, difficulty in establishing trusting relationships in the future, and possible long-term psychological consequences of that. And second, a second cost that they've identified is that the impact of multiple placements is known to be detrimental for the well-being of young foster children. However, they balance this with other benefits. So first, the opportunity to establish a relationship with siblings who, as I mentioned earlier, could potentially be the longest and most stable relationship that a child has in his or her life. Second, the opportunity to establish a familial and a cultural connection that the child may not have had in his or her foster home. And third, establishing sibling relationships can enhance a child's sense of identity as he or she grows and develops and really learns about his or her experience of being placed in foster care. And so there are very, very thoughtful considerations to make when considering placing siblings together or apart, particularly as they relate to very, very young children. So determining the appropriate placement for each child is very, very complex. These are just some of the questions that child welfare workers and court personnel may ask themselves when thinking about a placement change. And therapists who treat a child or family may be able to speak to some of these questions in their court testimony as well. So, what is the age of the child, and what do the research outcomes suggest about attachment disruption at this age? Another question that leads us to consider placement changes and what to do in those situations is, what is the nature of the sibling relationship? Is the sibling acting as a caretaker? Are the siblings even known to one another? Is there a history of abuse or a history of shared extreme trauma that may give us pause as to whether or not the child should be placed together with siblings or separate? And within that, if it's appropriate, has counseling been tried to improve the sibling relationship or reduce trauma symptoms? Another question to ask is, would the child experience more harm from a move than benefit from being placed with a sibling? And if the answer is yes, how could visitation support the sibling relationship, even if placement together is not possible? Another question to ask is, what are the needs of each individual child? We have to think about the whole sibling group, but we also have to think about the specific needs of each child. Finally, where do the children wish to be placed? Are they at the place where they have the developmental capacity to communicate their wishes? And if so, what are those wishes? Okay. And so there's several big takeaways, I think, from our conversation today. First is that expert and fact witnesses are really, really important in court proceedings. And for therapists, it's really important to know which type of witness you are and to maintain that role. Second, attachment's critical for all development. And we talked about ways in which disruptions to attachment are associated with a variety of different negative outcomes. And so preserving attachment relationships is important for avoiding poor outcomes. And so we must be very, very thoughtful when we're considering severing or disrupting an attachment relationship. Related to siblings, they often experience positive relationships or positive outcomes related to being placed together, but sometimes it's necessary to consider placement apart. Okay, so those are some of the big takeaways. I wanted to make sure to leave everybody with some resources, because when I was first kind of investigating some of these issues, I didn't know where to turn, the first time that I was subpoenaed in court proceedings. And so I wanted to share some of the resources that I have found kind of along the way that could be helpful for mental health therapists, as well as some court personnel resources that I found as well. So the first three resources on court testimony are by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They have some handouts that are really for therapists on how to prepare for testimony, kind of how to understand your role in the court hearing and what that court hearing will be like, and then how to think about and process with families after you have provided testimony in the court hearing. The last resource on the bottom of this slide is from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. They have a really neat resource related to guidelines for improving court practice in child abuse and neglect cases, including different sort of bench cards, as they call them, which help to identify some of the questions that judges and really court personnel could be asking in order to make some of these determinations regarding placement. There's a great resource on attachment when thinking about young children. Within this resource, they talk about different challenges that arise within children who are in the child welfare system. And then they also provide some recommendations on how to potentially address some of those challenges in a really, really thoughtful way. So I wanted to pass that along to all of you as well. And then finally, I wanted to provide some resources on sibling placement. A couple of articles related to considering kind of this idea of best interests and thinking about different ages of children. So the first article that's mentioned is for older children, and then the second one is specifically related to thinking about the best interest of infants, which we can really think about as being extended to very young children as well. And so I wanted to make sure to leave some time for us to talk through some questions that may arise. And so, Chad, I'm hoping that we can, I'm not getting to turn here. I'm hoping that we can have a moment to ask questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Vanderzee. Yeah, if you have a question, be sure to type that in. I know Dr. Gondure is also on the webinar, and I just wanted to pass along this resource too that she mentioned. It's the Association of Family and Consultation Courts. And so I think what I'll do is after this webinar, I will, everyone who attended, just kind of send them these resources that you had mentioned, Dr. Vanderzee, and just any others that if folks want to chime in, I can just kind of put that on an email for you guys. So we do have one question that came in. Can you speak a little bit about how siblings are evaluated, or if they get evaluated on good, bad relationships? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. So within the literature, there is discussion on how to conduct evaluations with siblings. Within that, I think there are recommendations first and foremost to ensure that if children are able to provide information regarding their relationships with one another, to get a sense of how they get along, that's a great way to kind of get started. In addition, in the literature, they also discuss the need for observations. And so gathering history and clinical interviews is absolutely important, and so is observation and getting kind of the perspectives of children as well. I want to kind of leave that there as that, because actually providing information related to that question could be actually its own webinar on how to conduct those evaluations. But for now, I think I'll just say that.
Okay, thanks. Another question that came in is, can you speak a little bit about, are there any available treatments for RAD, reactive attachment disorder, or talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. And so, within reactive attachment disorder, to my knowledge, there are no evidence-based treatments that are designed specifically to target RAD symptoms. However, when we look at the histories of children who have been given that diagnosis, they have experienced trauma symptoms. And so the good news is that we have great evidence-based treatments for children who have experienced trauma and who are showing trauma symptoms. We have For our youngest children, we have child-parent psychotherapy, which is evidence-based for children birth through age 5 and has good sound data on that. For children ages 2 to 7 who are showing behavior problems with or without additional trauma symptoms, parent-child interaction therapy is also evidence-based and has been shown to reduce trauma symptoms. And finally, we have trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy for children ages 3 through 17. These children are children who have experienced trauma and are showing trauma symptoms as well. For those of you who may be less familiar with the ARBEST website, on our website, we have a roster of clinicians who are either currently in training or who have been trained in these different evidence-based treatments. And so if you are looking for a therapist who has been trained in one of these evidence-based treatments, I would encourage you to go to our website and look at those rosters of trained clinicians and have that be a starting place of where you may refer a family. We've got it organized by city or county. It's really easy to search and hopefully find a match for a child and family to receive the best evidence-based care possible to give them the best chance at moving through their traumatic experiences.
Hey, thanks. And we're gonna do one more question here, and then I'll advance it to the CEU slide. And so we've had a couple of questions or scenarios kind of come in, and I think it kind of this individual's scenario kind of captures some others that are going on. So I'm just going to read it out loud and have you respond if that's okay.
Sure.
Often we need the child's therapist to provide testimony regarding the child's treatment and current functioning. The judge often wants to ask for recommendations on issues like visitation and contact with non-offending relatives. Sometimes it seems like therapists or counselors are hesitant or hesitant to make any recommendations or reluctant to come to court. Any suggestions how to get the facts we need into evidence? So I'm seeing a lot of that kind of maybe from our court side of folks, and just kind of your 2 cents, Dr. Banerjee, and how they could bridge that gap.
Absolutely. And so, you know, one of the ways that we therapists can provide great information to courts is by providing court update letters. So assuming that both sides agree to have that admitted as evidence, that can be a fantastic way to get information related to attendance, participation, and treatment progress. I have written a number of court update letters and do so regularly on my court-involved cases. So I think that's a great way. Second, I think it's important to understand too that when therapists are subpoenaed, what that ends up meaning for them is that they may have to cancel their entire day of patients. And so it can be really difficult for a variety of different reasons for therapists to be able to come to court, you know, many times. So if they have to cancel their schedule, that may mean that other children and families are not able to get the care that they may need. And there may be very stressful or other situations that could be, you know, of concern to a therapist, and you know, they may be hesitant to cancel their schedule. So one thing that is really helpful is if you as legal professionals are aware that you're going to have a hearing coming up in which you may want to have court testimony from a therapist, give them as much notice as possible so that they can make adjustments to their schedules, so that they can continue to meet the needs of their children and families that they work with, and also meet the needs of the children and families that are related, that are you know, being asked about in court proceedings, because all of those children and families are important. Now, related to the part of the question about hesitancy to provide recommendations related to visitation and placement, we talked earlier really about the role of expert and fact witnesses. Many therapists are going to be entering court testimony in that role of fact witness. And as a fact witness, therapists don't have access to all of the information that would be necessary in order to provide an opinion related to placement and visitation. And further, their impressions and experiences working with one caregiver and the child, for example, may inherently put them kind of in a biased role. And so, in those situations, therapists often will shy away from making those recommendations just because it's outside of that role of fact witness.
Thank you. So yeah, I know there's several of you that kind of asked that, so I think it's a really great question to ask. So, okay, so on your screen in front of you now, the code for today's webinar is 2101. After we're done here, I'm going to send an email, and there will be a link to a survey where you'll be asked to enter that code. So if you need a CEU for today's webinar, please jot this down. The code is 2101, and shortly after this webinar, I will send an email to you if you attended. If you happen to be watching with a group, feel free to forward that email on to others. And so once you enter that code in and the email you put there, that's where the CEU will go. So yeah. If there's any other questions, I know a lot came in, we'll try to take those offline as well. But there is one other question I'm hoping that you can answer, Dr. Vanderzee, and that's someone had mentioned that they're involved with the CASA program, and does the CASA program or other programs like that, does that help with attachment? Can you kind of talk about that for a minute?
So CASAs are absolutely wonderful. So CASAs are court-appointed special advocates who are volunteers of the court who develop a relationship with children, a child or children, in order to provide information to the court for things regarding placement and visitation. And so, I guess I can tie this answer into the previous question as well. CASAs are wonderful at providing impressions and are able really to provide informed opinions regarding placement and visitation for children and families. In terms of Chad, tell me the question again. Now that I got started on that soapbox, I lost it.
Yeah, they're just wondering if a child's involved with CASA, does that help with their attachment? Yeah.
And so attachment relationships are relationship specific. So a CASA would probably not be providing the level of day-to-day care that would be necessary to form an actual attachment relationship, because we need children to have thousands and thousands of interactions with a person in a caregiving role in order to form that attachment. A CASA is someone with whom they may develop a strong relationship, but may not turn to in times of stress or fear or uncertainty, kind of in the same way that they might develop an attachment relationship with an actual caregiver.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just reminded too that if you are needing continuing legal education, that I have that form, and Stacia also has that form as well, and so we'll kind of coordinate and we'll get that to you. But I have that form if you're needing that as well. That's for the continuing legal education. So okay, well, I'll leave this code up here for a little bit. Remember to jot it down. Dr. Vanderzee, thank you so much for today's webinar.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks, Chad.